a post about levels of lucidity. Quote, as we grow older, it becomes apparent that our self-reflexive mind is not just gradually accumulating ideas about itself, but that it progresses in somewhat distinct stages. So there's 7 of the stages. Stage 1, reactive survival, infant. Stage 2, personal self, young child. Stage 3, social self, adolescence, domesticated adult. Stage 4 is rational agency, self-direction. Stage 5 is self-authoring. That's full adult. You've achieved wisdom, but there's 2 more stages. Stage 6 is enlightenment. Stage 7 is transcendence. Can you explain each, or the interesting parts of each of these stages? And what's your sense why there are stages of this, of lucidity as we progress through life in this too short life?
This model is derived from a concept by the psychologist Robert Kegan.
Herr Doktor, impf mir nix. Wir gucken jetzt Joscha Bach und dann chillen wir raus. Dann gehen wir raus aus dem Stream. Heraus. Ja. 3. Teil. Wir haben ja schon die ersten beiden geguckt. Und ich bin ja großer Joscha Bach-Fan, deswegen gucken wir das zusammen. Naja, nicht gleich. Das geht jetzt gerade los. Wir gucken jetzt 1 Stunde oder so.
And he talks about the development of the self as a process that happens in principle by some kind of reverse engineering of a mind, where you gradually become aware of yourself and thereby build structure that allows you to interact deeper with the world and yourself. And I found myself using this model not so much as a developmental model. I'm not even sure if it's a very good developmental model, because I saw my children not progressing exactly like that. And I also suspect that you don't go through these stages necessarily in succession, and it's not that you work through one stage and then you get into the next one. Sometimes you revisit them, sometimes stuff is happening in parallel. But it's, I think, a useful framework to look at what's present in the structure of a person and how they interact with the world and how they relate to themselves. So it's more like a philosophical framework that allows you to talk about how minds work. And at first, when we are born, we don't have a personal self yet, I think. Instead, we have an attentional self. And this attentional self is initially in the infant tasked with building a world model and also an initial model of the self. But mostly it's building a game engine in the brain that is tracking sensory data and uses it to explain it. And in some sense, you could compare it to game.
Wir sind ja mittlerweile Joscha Bach-Veteranen, deswegen wissen wir das schon, ne? Das haben wir alles schon geklärt.
Game engine like Minecraft or so colors and sounds, people are all not physical objects. They are creation of our mind at a certain level of coarse graining, models that are mathematical, that use geometry and that use manipulation of objects and so on to create scenes in which we can find ourselves and interact with them.
So Minecraft.
Yeah, and this personal self is something that is more or less created after the world is finished, after it's trained into the system, after it has been constructed. And this personal self is an agent that interacts with the outside world. And the outside world is not the world of quantum mechanics, not the physical universe, but it's the model that has been generated in our own mind.
Ja, das ist immer besonders wichtig, dass ihr euch das klar macht. Die physikalische Realität, oder sagen wir mal so, das beste Modell, was wir haben eigentlich, hat nichts mit dem zu tun, was wir in unserer täglichen Erfahrung als Weltmodell annehmen. Unser Weltmodell besteht aus makroskopischen Objekten, die emergieren. Die sind so gar nicht da. Das ist ein Sonderfall. Die emergieren und wir sagen halt, okay, diese Bierflasche und dieser Tisch, die unterscheiden sich und zwar so und so, insbesondere in ihrer Form, ihrer Abgrenzung und dass sie unterschiedliche Positionen im Raum einnehmen. Eine quantenmechanische Beschreibung wäre komplett anders, ne? In einer quantenmechanischen Beschreibung würde man erstmal den Unterschied zwischen diesen beiden Objekten nicht wahrnehmen können, weil dazwischen ist so viel Zahlensalat und so eine enorm große Wellenfunktion, dass man das nicht checkt. Außerdem kollabieren hier die Wellenfunktionen permanent und so und das ist übelst fies, ne? Das heißt, wir haben tatsächlich eher sowas wie eine Game Engine, wenn wir darüber reden, was wir eigentlich wahrnehmen und was wir Welt und Realität meinen. Das ist eine Simulation. Und die entsteht dadurch, dass unser Gehirn dieses inverse Problem lösen will. Was hat die Inputdaten verursacht?
Right, and this is us, and we experience ourselves interacting is that outside world that is created outside of our own mind. And outside of ourself, there's feelings and they be presented our interface to
Ja, voll. Also es gibt nicht die Wahrheit jetzt in dem Sinne. Es geht bei wissenschaftlichen Theorien nur darum, die bestmögliche Theorie zu finden, die also so widerspruchsfrei wie möglich ist. Wir versuchen ein Optimierungsproblem zu finden. Wir versuchen ein Weltmodell zu bauen, das möglichst konsistent mit unseren Beobachtungen ist. Und das Beste, was wir gefunden haben, nennen wir Physik. Ja. Und mit Wahrheit hat das nichts zu tun. Wahrheit ist entweder eine mathematische Terminologie oder es ist etwas, was emergiert. Aus einem Konsens zwischen Menschen zum Beispiel. Und Wahrheit hast du in der Wissenschaft in dem Sinne sowieso nicht. Du hast Evaluierung und du hast halt Scientific Konsens, ne? Aber kein Physiker würde ernsthaft sagen, dass die physikalischen Modelle die Realität beschreiben. Also, dass sie die Realität sind. Sondern sie sagen, die beschreiben die Realität, die wir wahrnehmen, am besten. Ja, das ist nicht dasselbe.
this outside world, they pose problems to us. These feelings are basically attitudes that our mind is computing that tell us what's needed in the world, the things that we are drawn to, the things that we are afraid of. And we are tasked with solving this problem of satisfying the needs, avoiding the aversions, following on our inner commitments and so on, and also modeling ourselves and building the next stage. So after we have this personal self in stage 2 online, many people form a social self. And this social self allows the individual to experience themselves as part of a group.
Mhm.
It's basically this thing that when you are playing in a team, for instance, you don't notice yourself just as a single note that is reaching out into the world, but you're also looking down. You're looking down from this entire group and you see how this group is looking at this individual. And everybody in the group is in some sense emulating this group spirit to some degree. And in this state, people are forming their opinions by assimilating them from this group mind. They basically gain the ability to act a little bit like a hive mind.
But are you also modeling the interaction of how opinion?
Ne? Also sozusagen, wenn man sich selbst die Geschichte erzählt und die Gruppe erzählt sich die Geschichte, sie ist eine Gruppe und handelt zusammen, dann ist es wie ein Hive-Mind, ne? So sagt er das, so eine Schwarmintelligenz eigentlich. Ja, das ist auch das, was wir beobachten können. Zum Beispiel Mannschaften in einem Mannschaftssport oder so. Towards a goal, together. Hallo Ghoul.
Opinion shapes and forms through the interaction of the individual nodes within the group.
Yeah, it's basically the way in which people do it in a stage is that they experience what are the opinions of my environment. They experience the relationship that they have to their environment, and they resonate with people around them, and get more opinions in this through this interaction, through the way in which they relate to others. And at stage 4, you basically understand that stuff is true and false independently what other people believe, and you have agency over your own beliefs in that stage. You basically discover epistemology, the rules about determining what's true and false.
So you start to learn how to think.
Yes. I mean, at some level, you're always thinking, you are constructing
Hallo,
things.
Jane
And I believe that this ability to reason about your mental representation is what we mean by thinking. It's an intrinsically reflexive process that requires consciousness. Without
Joscha Bach ist ein Deutscher. Joscha Bach ist sogar ein Ostdeutscher.
consciousness, you cannot think. You can generate the content of feelings and so on outside of consciousness. It's very hard to be conscious of how your feelings emerge, at least in the early stages of development. But thoughts is something that you always control.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are a nerd like me, you often have to skip stage 3 because you lack the intuitive empathy with others. Because in order to resonate with a group, you need to have a quite similar architecture.
Ja, exakt. Du musst auch richtig Bock haben auf diese Gruppenvibes und du musst dir denken, ja, das ist jetzt was mit den Gruppenvibes und wir wollen jetzt hier alle zusammen was erreichen und so.
And if
Hallo,
people are
Bartmensch.
wired differently, then it's hard for them to resonate with other people and basically have empathy, which is not the same as compassion, but it is a shared perceptual mental state. Empathy happens not just via inference about the mental states of others, but it's a perception of what other people feel and where they're at.
Can't you not have empathy while also not having a similar architecture? cognitive architecture as the others in the
I
group?
think, yes, but I experienced that too. But you need to build something that is like a meta architecture. You need to be able to embrace the architecture of the other to some degree, or find some shared common ground. And it's also this issue that if you are a nerd, normies often, so people, basically neurotypical people, have difficulty to resonate with you. And as a result, they have difficulty understanding you unless they have enough wisdom to feel what's going on there.
Well, isn't the whole process of the stage 3s to figure out the API to the other humans that have different architecture, and you yourself publish public documentation for the API that people can interact with for you? Isn't this the whole process of socializing?
My experience as a child growing up was that I did not find any way to interface with the stage 3 people, and they didn't do that with me. So
Did you try?
Yeah, of course, I tried it very hard.
Ich habe es auch probiert und meine Methode der Wahl, nachdem ich zu oft verprügelt wurde von den normalen Fußballidioten und so, war witzig sein. Witzig sein war meine Schnittstelle. Dann ging's. Dann konnte ich auch mit den Normalos reden und so. Und dann hatte ich auch einen sozialen Status, der mir dann rübergereicht wurde, und dann war ich Teil der Gruppe irgendwie, und dann war das cool. Bis ich dann irgendwann in der 9. oder 10. Klasse angefangen habe, wieder mein eigenes Ding so krass zu machen, dass ich wieder die anderen ausgegrenzt habe. Dass ich mir das auch leisten konnte, die anderen wieder auszugrenzen. Sozial jetzt.
But it was only when I entered a mathematics school at 9th grade, where lots of other nerds were present, that I found people that I could deeply resonate with, and had the impression that, yes, I have friends now. I found my own people. And before that, I felt extremely lonely in the world. There was basically nobody I could connect to. And I remember there was one moment in all these years where I was in, there was a school exchange, and there was a Russian boy, kid from the Russian garrison stationed in Eastern Germany, who visited our school. And we played a game of chess against each other. And we looked into each other's eyes, and we sat there for 2 hours playing this game of chess. And I had the impression, this is a human being. He understands what I understand. We didn't even speak the same language.
I wonder if your
Turing-Test
life could have
quasi.
been different if you knew that it's okay to be different, to have a different architecture. Whether like accepting that the interface is hard to figure out, takes a long time to figure out, and it's okay to be different. In fact, it's beautiful to be different.
It was not my main concern. My main concern was mostly that I was alone. Right? It was not so much the question, is it okay to be the way I am? I couldn't do much about it, so I had to deal with it. But my main issue was that I was not sure if I would ever meet anybody growing up that I would connect to at such a deep level that I would feel that I could belong.
So there's a visceral, undeniable feeling of being alone.
Yes. And I noticed the same thing when I came into the math school, that I think at least half, probably 2/3 of these kids were severely traumatized as children growing up, and in large part due to being alone, because they couldn't find anybody to relate to.
Don't you think everybody's alone deep down?
No.
Oh.
Also, I'm not alone. I'm not alone anymore. It took me some time to update and to get over the traumata and so on, but I felt that in my 20s, I had lots of friends and I had my place in the world, and I had no longer doubts that I would never be alone again.
Is there some aspect to which we're alone together? You don't see a deep loneliness inside yourself still?
No. Sorry.
Okay, so that's the nonlinear progression through the stages, I suppose. You caught up on stage 3 at some point?
So we were at stage 4. And so basically I find that many nerds jump straight into stage 4, bypassing stage 3.
Do they return to it then later?
Yeah, of course. Sometimes they do, not always.
Yeah.
The question is basically, do you stay a little bit autistic or do you catch up? And I believe you can catch up. You can build this missing structure.
Yeah.
And basically experience yourself as part of a group, learn intuitive empathy, and develop the sense, this perceptual sense of feeling what other people feel. And before that, I could only basically feel this when I was deeply in love with somebody and we synced, or...
So there's a lot of friction to feeling that way. Like it only with certain people, as opposed to it comes naturally.
Yeah.
It's frictionless.
But this is something that basically later I felt started to resolve itself for me to a large degree.
What was the trick?
In many ways, growing up and paying attention. Meditation did help. I had some very crucial experiences in getting close to people, building connections, cuddling a lot in my student years.
So really paying attention
Hippie-Zeug auf jeden Fall.
to
Hippie-Zeug.
what
Ich
is
sag's
it?
euch,
To the
kuscheln, Alter.
feeling another human being fully.
Loving other people and being loved by other people, and
Simple.
building a space in which you can be safe and can experiment and
Habe ich schon
touch a
beobachtet.
lot and be close to
Kuscheln
somebody
und
a
so.
lot.
Ich hab's
And
wirklich gesehen.
over time, basically, at some point you realize, oh, it's no longer that I feel locked out, but I feel connected and I experience where somebody else is at. And normally my mind is racing very fast at a high frequency, so it's not always working like this. Sometimes it works better, sometimes it works less. But I also don't see this as a pressure. It's interesting to observe myself, which frequency I'm at and at which mode somebody else is at.
Yeah, man, the mind is so beautiful in that way. Sometimes it comes so natural to me, so easy to pay attention to the world
Prost.
fully, to other people fully. And sometimes the stress over silly things is overwhelming.
Mhm.
It's so interesting that the mind is that roller coaster in that way.
At stage 5, you discover how identity is constructed.
Self-offering.
Realize that your values are not terminal, but they are instrumental to achieving a world that you like and aesthetics that you prefer.
Yeah.
And the more you understand this, the more you get agency over how your identity is constructed. And you realize that identity in interpersonal interaction is a costume. And you should be able to have agency over that costume, right? It's useful to wear a costume. It tells something to others and it allows to interface in roles. But
Ich habe ja über das Konstrukt der Identitäten in meinem Buch dann auch nochmal ein extra Kapitel geschrieben. Weil Identitäten sind wichtig, ne? Und ich habe auch schon ein paar Videos darüber gemacht, ne? Dass wir sozusagen Geschichten brauchen für den performativen Akt der Gesellschaft und so. Das geht alles über Identitäten und so, klar.
being locked into this is a big limitation.
The word costume kind of implies that it's fraudulent in some way. Is costume a good word for you? Like we
No.
present ourselves to the world.
In some sense, I learned a lot about costumes at Burning Man. Before that, I did not really appreciate costumes and saw them more as uniforms, like wearing a suit if you are working in a bank or if you are trying to get startup funding from a VC in Switzerland. Right, then you dress up in a particular way, and this is mostly to show the other side that you are willing to play by the rules and you understand what the rules are. But there is something deeper. When you are at Burning Man, your costume becomes self-expression, and there is no boundary to the self-expression. You're basically free to wear what you want, to express other people what you feel like this day and what kind of interactions you want to have.
Is the costume a kind of projection of who you are?
That's very hard to say because the costume also depends on what other people see in the costume. And this depends on the
Sure.
context that the other people understand. And so you have to create something, if you want to, that is legible to the other side. And that means something to yourself.
Do we become prisoners of the costume? Because everybody expects us
Some
to.
people do. But I think that once you realize that you wear a costume at Burning Man, a variety of costumes, realize that you cannot not wear a costume.
Yeah.
Right? Basically, everything that you wear and
Exakt.
present to others is something
Immer.
that is to some degree in addition to what you are deep inside.
So this stage, in parentheses, you put full adult, comma, wisdom. Why is this full adult? Why would you say this is full? And why is it wisdom?
It does allow you to understand why other people have different identities from yours. And it allows you to understand that the difference between people who vote for different parties and might have very different opinions and different value systems is often the accident of where they are born and what happened after that to them and what traits they got before they were born. And at some point you realize a perspective where you understand that everybody could be you in a different timeline. If you just flip those
Das sagt er übelst gerne mit der Different Timeline, ne? Das ist so sein Ding mit der Different Timeline. Da steht er richtig drauf. Und es macht auch total Sinn, ne? Weil wir sind alle Datenverarbeitung, wir haben alle das mit der Datenverarbeitung im Kopf. Der einzige Unterschied ist, dass wir mit unterschiedlichen Startbedingungen, unterschiedlichen Daten angefangen haben, ne? Und auch permanent andere Daten reinkriegen als andere. Das ist der Unterschied. Sonst gibt es keinen Unterschied. Die Daten sind der Unterschied.
bits.
How many costumes do you have?
I don't count. But
More than one?
yeah, of course.
How easy is it to do costume changes throughout the day?
It's just a matter of energy and interest. When you are wearing your pajamas and you switch out of your pajamas into, say, a work short and pants, you're making a costume change, right? And if you are putting on a gown, you're making a costume change.
And you could do the same with personality?
You could, if that's what you're into. There are people which have multiple personalities for interaction in multiple roles, right? So if somebody works in a store and you put up a storekeeper personality, when you're working, when you're presenting yourself at work, you develop a sub-personality for this. And the social persona for many people is in some sense a puppet that they're playing like a marionette. And if they play this all the time, they might forget that there is something behind this. There's something what it feels like to be in your skin. And I guess it's very helpful if you're able to get back into this. And for me, it's the other way around is relatively hard. For me, it's pretty hard to learn how to play consistent social roles. For me, it's much easier just to be real.
Or not real, but to have one costume.
No, it's not quite the same. So basically, when you are wearing a costume at Burning Man and say you are an extraterrestrial prince, there's something where you are expressing, in some sense, something that's closer to yourself than the way in which you hide yourself behind standard clothing when you go out in the city, in the default world. And so this costume that you're wearing at Burning Man allows you to express more of yourself. And
ja, also wenn ihr diese Kinderdebatte über GEZ wirklich weiterführen wollt, dann macht das doch einfach im Discord oder so. Weil ich meine, sich wegen 20 € im Monat anpissen, wenn wir eigentlich in einem Ausbeutersystem leben, ist schon stark.
You have a shorter distance of advertising to people what kind of person you are, what kind of interaction you would want to have with them. And so you get much earlier into medias res. And I believe it's regrettable that we do not use the opportunities that we have with custom-made clothing now to wear costumes that are much more stylish, that are much more custom-made, that are not necessarily part of a fashion in which you express which milieu you're part of and how up-to-date you are, but you also express how you are as an individual and what you want to do today and how you feel today and what you intend to do about it.
Well, isn't it easier now in the digital world to explore different costumes? I mean, that's the kind of idea with virtual reality. That's the idea, even with Twitter in 2-dimensional screens. You can swap all costumes. You can be as weird as you want. It's easier. For Burning Man, you have to order things. You have to make things. It's more effort.
Joscha Bach hat angefangen, ne? Mit dem Burning Man, mit dieser Burning Man Metapher und so, weil er findet das geil mit dem Burning Man, ne?
It's even better if you make them yourselves.
Sure, but it's just easier to do digitally, right?
It's not about easy. It's about how to get it right. And for me, the first Burning Man experience, I got adopted by a bunch of people in Boston who dragged me to Burning Man. And we spent a few weekends doing costumes together. And it was an important part of the experience where the camp bonded, that people got to know each other. And we basically grew into the experience that we would have later.
So the extraterrestrial prince is based on a true story?
Yeah.
I can only imagine what that looks like. Joscha.
Okay.
Stage 6.
Stage 6. At some point, you can collapse the division between a personal self, and world generator again. And a lot of people get there via meditation, or some of them get there via psychedelics, some of them by accident. And you suddenly notice that you are not actually a person, but you are a vessel that can create a person. And the person is still there. You observe that personal self, but you observe the personal self from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And you notice it's a representation. And you might also notice that the world that is being created is a representation. If not, then you might experience that I am the universe, I am the thing that is creating everything. And of course, what you're creating is not quantum mechanics and the physical universe. What you're creating is this game engine
Mm-hmm.
that is updating the world, and you're creating your valence, your feelings, your and all the people inside of that world, including the person that you identify with yourself in this world.
Are you creating the game engine, or are you noticing the game engine?
You noticed how you're generating the game engine. And I mean, when you are dreaming at night, you can, if you have a lucid dream, you can learn how to do this deliberately. And in principle, you can also do it during the day. And the reason why we don't get to do this from the beginning and why we don't have agency of our feelings right away is because we would game it before we have the necessary amount of wisdom to deal with creating this dream that we are in.
You don't want to get access to cheat codes too quickly, otherwise you won't enjoy.
So
the game.
stage 5 is already pretty rare, and stage 6 is even more rare. You basically find this mostly with advanced Buddhist meditators and so on that are dropping into this stage and can induce it at will and spend time in it.
So stage 5 requires a good therapist. Stage 6 requires a good Buddhist spiritual leader.
Yes, so it is, for instance, could be that is the right thing to do. But it's not that these stages give you scores or levels that you need to advance to. It's not that the next stage is better.
Mm-hmm.
You live your life in the mode that works best at any given moment. And when your mind decides that you should have a different configuration, then it's building that configuration. And for many people, they stay happily at stage 3 and experience themselves as part of groups.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with this. And for some people, this doesn't work, and they're forced to build more agency over their rational beliefs than this and construct their norms rationally. And so they go to this level.
Mm-hmm.
And stage 7 is something that is more or less hypothetical. That would be the stage in which it's basically a transhumanist stage, in which you understand how you work, in which the mind fully realizes how it's implemented, and can also, in principle, enter different modes in which it could be implemented. And that's the stage that, as far as I understand, is not open to people yet.
Oh, but it is possible through the process of technology.
Yes, and who knows if there are biological agents that are working at different timescales than us that basically become aware of the way in which they're implemented on ecosystems and can change that implementation and have agency over how they're implemented in the world. And what I find interesting about the discussion about AI alignment, that it seems to be following these stages very much. Most people seem to be in stage 3, also according to Robert Keegan.
Mm-hmm.
I think he says that about 85% of people are in stage 3 and stay there.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in stage 3 and your opinions are the result of social assimilation, then what you're mostly worried about in the AI is that the AI might have the wrong opinions. Yeah. So if the AI says something racist or sexist, we are all lost because we will assimilate the wrong opinions from the AI. And so we need to make sure that the AI has the right opinions and the right values and the right structure. And if you're at stage 4, that's not your main concern. And so most nerds don't really worry about the algorithmic bias in the model that it picks up, because if there's something wrong with this bias, the AI ultimately will prove it. At some point, we'll get it there that it makes mathematical proofs about reality, and then it will figure out what's true and what's false. But you're still worried that the AI might turn you into paperclips because it might have the wrong values, right? So if it's set up with the wrong function that controls its direction in the world, then...
Also das mit dem Paperclip Maximizer ist euch bekannt, ne? Das ist die triviale Vorstellung von irgendeiner AGI mit einer völlig bescheuerten Kostenfunktion, zum Beispiel von einer Firma gebaut, die einfach nur Paperclips herstellt. Und sie soll eine Kosten-Nutzen-Sache machen und einfach so viele Paperclips wie möglich, also Büroklammern, herstellen. Und dann kann sie halt Nanotechnik, weil sie ja AGI ist sie super krass, auch Nanotechnik, und kann alles in Paperclips verwandeln. Und nichts hält sie mehr davon ab, alles in Paperclips zu verwandeln. Insbesondere die Menschen und der Konzern und alles, die ganze Erde. Und dann geht sie ins Universum und verwandelt das komplette Universum, alles in Paperclips. Und das ist das Standardbeispiel für das Alignment-Problem. Denn dann haben wir eine AGI, die ist super schlau, aber sie macht überhaupt nicht das, was wir wollen.
do something that is completely horrible and there's no easy way to fix it.
So that's more like a stage 4 rationalist kind of
Yes.
worry.
And if you are at stage 5, you're mostly worried that the AI is not going to be enlightened fast enough, because you realize that the game is not so much about intelligence, but
Nein, Herr Dr. Impfminix, das werde ich nicht tun. Du hast angefangen mit der Kackdebatte, das kannst du jetzt auch einfach selber ausbaden. Ich war kurz davor, dich wegzuklicken und dir irgendwie einen Timeout zu geben wegen diesem Schwachsinn.
about agency, about the ability to control the future. And the identity is instrumental to this. And if you are a human being, I think at some level you ought to choose your own identity. You should not have somebody else pick the costume for you and then wear it, but instead you should be mindful about what you want to be in this world. And I think if you are an agent that is fully malleable, that can rewrite its own source code, like an AI might do at some point, then the identity...
Schröck, exakt, genau das ist es. Als hättest du schon mein Buch gelesen. Ne? Genau, die Kapitalakkumulation ist die Zielfunktion, die im Moment misaligned mit dem Wohl für alle. Und deswegen, wir haben ein AGI-Problem. Jetzt schon. Wir sind kleine Turing-Maschinen und wir konstruieren und auf uns emergiert das, was wir Kapitalismus und Kapitalakkumulation nennen. Und es ist mehr oder weniger eine AGI. Sie ist bloß misaligned. Und sie hat ein schlechtes Weltmodell. Ne? Klar.
that you will have is whatever you can be. And in this way, the AI will maybe become everything, like a planetary control system. And if it does that, then if we want to coexist with it, it means that it will have to share purposes with us. So it cannot be a transactional relationship. We will not be able to use reinforcement learning with human feedback to hardwire its values into it. But this has to happen is probably that it's conscious, so it can relate to our own mode of existence, where an observer is observing itself in real time.
Der Name des Buchs steht noch nicht fest. Es kommt im 1. März. Ich nehme mal an, das Buch heißt Das gesellschaftliche Problem. Aber das ist nicht klar.
Within certain temporal frames. And the other thing is that it probably needs to have some kind of transcendental orientation, building shared agency. And in the same way as we do when we are able to enter with each other into non-transactional relationships. And I find that something that, because the stage 5 is so rare, is missing in much of the discourse. And I think that we need, in some sense, focus on how to formalize love, how to understand love, and how to build it into the machines that we are currently building and that are about to become smarter than us.
Well, I think this is a good opportunity to try to sneak up to the idea of enlightenment. So you wrote a series of good tweets about consciousness and panpsychism. So let's break it down. First, you say, I suspect the experience that leads to the panpsychism syndrome of some philosophers and other consciousness enthusiasts represents the realization that we don't end at the self, but share a resonant universe representation with every other observer coupled to the same universe. This actually eventually leads us to a lot of interesting questions about AI and AGI, but let's start with this representation. What is this?
Ja, Herr Dr. Impfminix, das ist Joscha Bach. Es ist natürlich schade, dass du ihn nicht kennst, aber ich kann dir jetzt nicht erklären, was wir hier alles schon uns reingezogen haben. Und offenbar bist du auch nicht bekannt, also ist dir auch nicht klar, was mein Material auf YouTube so zu bieten hat. Sonst würdest du diese Fragen nicht stellen. Ich kann dir, also wenn dich das interessiert, dann zieh dir einfach meinen YouTube-Scheiß rein. Ich habe da sogar Playlists für jetzt die Sache mit dem Bewusstsein und dem Weltmodell und diesem ganzen Kram. Das Buch ist schon fertig. Es wird lektoriert und es kommt im 1. März raus. Ich habe im Prinzip 2 Monate durchgeschrieben dafür. Immer abends, wenn ich Zeit habe. Ging.
Resonant universe representation. And what do you think? Do we share such a representation?
The neuroscientist Grossberg has come up with a cognitive architecture that he calls the adaptive resonance theory. And his perspective is that our neurons can be understood as oscillators that are resonating with each other and with outside phenomena. So the coarse-grained model of the universe that we are building, in some sense, is a resonance with objects and outside of us in the world. So basically, we take up patterns that of the universe that we are coupled with, and our brain is not so much understood as circuitry.
Also die Sache mit den Oszillators ist natürlich immer so ein Witz eigentlich. Es ist ein Running Gag, ne? Man kann im Prinzip alles auf nichtlineare Oszillatoren abbilden. Das ist nichts anderes als, ja, man kann auch alles mit einem neuronalen Netz abbilden, weil der universelle Funktionsapproximator durch ein unendlich großes Layer immer abgebildet werden kann und so weiter und so fort, ne? Das ist eigentlich eine Trivialität mit den Oszillatoren. Die braucht man hier eigentlich nicht, aber er benutzt jetzt diese Metapher auch.
Even though this perspective is valid, but it's almost an ether in which the individual neurons are passing on chemoelectrical signals or arbitrary signals across all modalities that can be transmitted between cells, stimulate each other in this way, and produce patterns that they modulate while passing them on. And this speed of signal progression in the brain is roughly at the speed of sound, incidentally, because the time that it takes for the signals to hop from cell to cell, which means it's relatively slow with respect to the world. It takes an appreciable fraction of a second for a signal to go through the entire neocortex, something like a few hundred milliseconds. And so there's a lot of stuff happening in that time where the signal is passing through your brain, including in the brain itself. So nothing in the brain is assuming that stuff happens simultaneously. Everything in the brain is working in a paradigm where the world has already moved on when you are ready to do the next thing to your signal, including the signal processing system itself. It's quite a different paradigm than the one in our digital computers, where we currently assume that your GPU or CPU is pretty much globally in the same state.
So you mentioned there the non-dual state and say that some people confuse.
Ich sagte, das ist interessant. Wir haben Verarbeitung auf verschiedenen Timescales, ne? Generell, unsere Datenverarbeitung funktioniert so.
Use it for enlightenment.
Yeah.
What's the non-dual state?
There is a state in which you notice that you are no longer a person, and instead you are one with the universe.
So that speaks to the resonance.
Yes, but this one with the universe is, of course, not accurately modeling that you are indeed some God entity or indeed the universe becoming aware of itself, even though you get this experience. I believe that you get this experience because your mind is modeling the fact that you are no longer identified with the personal self in that state, but you have transcended this division between the self model and the world model, and you are experiencing yourself as your mind, as something that is representing a universe.
But that's still part of the model.
Yes. So it's inside of the model. Still, you're still inside of patterns that are generated in your brain and in your organism. And what you are now experiencing is that you're no longer this personal self in there, but you are the entirety of the mind and its contents.
Why is it so hard to get there?
A lot of people who get into this state think this or associated with enlightenment. I suspect it's a favorite training goal for a number of meditators. But I think that enlightenment is in some sense more mundane, and it's a step further or sideways. It's the state where you realize that everything is a representation.
Yeah, you say enlightenment is a realization of how experience is implemented.
Yes. So basically, you notice at some point that your qualia can be deconstructed.
Reverse engineered? What, like almost like a schematic of it?
You can start with looking at a face. Maybe look at your own face in the mirror.
Yeah.
Look at your face for a few hours in the mirror or for a few minutes. At some point, it will look very weird, and because you notice that there's actually no face. You basically start unseeing the face. What you see is a geometry, and then you can assemble the geometry and realize how that geometry is being constructed in your mind. And you can learn to modify this. So basically, you can change these generators in your own mind to shift the face around or to change the construction of the face, to change the way in which the features are being assembled.
Why don't we do that more often? Why don't we start really messing with reality without the use of drugs or anything else? Why don't we get good at this kind of thing? Like intentionally.
Why should we? Why would
because
you
you
want to
can
do that?
morph reality into something more pleasant for yourself. Just have fun with it.
Yeah, that is probably what you shouldn't be doing, right? Because outside of your personal self, this
Yeah.
outer mind is probably a relatively smart agent. And what you often notice is that you have thoughts about how you should live,
Yeah.
but you observe yourself doing different things and having different feelings. And that's because your outer mind doesn't believe you and doesn't believe your rational thoughts.
Well, can't you just silence the outer mind?
The thing is that the outer mind is usually smarter than you are. Rational thinking is very brittle.
Hmm.
It's very hard to use logic and symbolic thinking to have an accurate model of the world. So there is often an underlying system that is looking at your rational thoughts and then tells you, no, you're still missing something. Your gut feeling is still saying something else. And this can be, for instance, you find a partner that looks perfect, or you find a deal when you build a company or whatever that looks perfect to you. And yet at some level you feel something is off and you cannot put your finger on it. And the more you reason about it, the better it looks to you. But the system that is outside still tells you, no, you're missing something.
And that system is powerful.
People call this intuition, right? Intuition is this unreflected part of your attitude composition and computation.
Und die tötet man wahrscheinlich, oder sagen wir mal, die dekomposiert man auch, wenn man enlightened ist, ne?
Where you produce a model of how you relate to the world and what you need to do it in it and what you can do in it and what's going to happen, that is usually deeper and often more accurate than your reason.
So if we look at this, as you write in the tweet, if we look at this more rigorously, as a sort of take the panpsychist idea more seriously, almost as a scientific discipline, you write that, quote, fascinatingly, the panpsychist interpretation seems to lead to observations of practical results to a degree that physics fundamentalists might call superstitious. Reports of long-distance telepathy and remote causation are ubiquitous in the general population. I am not convinced, says Joscha Bach, that establishing the empirical reality of telepathy would force an update of any part of serious academic physics, but it could trigger an important revolution in both neuroscience and AI from a circuit perspective to a coupled complex resonator paradigm. Are you suggesting that?
So geil, oder? Der hat wirklich witzige Sachen schon in Twitter rausgehauen. Eigentlich lohnt es sich für Joscha tatsächlich, für mich jetzt zum Beispiel, würde es sich lohnen, Twitter zu benutzen eigentlich.
There
Weil er
could be
einfach witzig ist, der
some
Mann.
rigorous mathematical wisdom to panpsychist perspective on the world?
So first of all, panpsychism is the perspective that consciousness is inseparable from matter in the universe. And I find panpsychism quite unsatisfying because it does not explain consciousness, right? It does not explain how this aspect of matter produces it. It's also when I try to formalize panpsychism and write down what it actually means and with a more formal mathematical language, it's very difficult to distinguish it from saying that there is a software side to the world, in the same way as there is software side to what the transistors are doing in your computer. So basically, there's a pattern at a certain coarse graining of the universe that in some reasons of the universe leads to observers that are observing themselves, right? So panpsychism maybe is not even, when I write it down, a position that is distinct from functionalism. But intuitively, a lot of people feel that the activity of matter itself, of mechanisms in the world, is insufficient to explain it. So it's something that needs to be intrinsic to matter itself.
Mhm.
And you can, apart from this abstract idea, have an experience in which you experience yourself as being the universe,
Mhm.
which I suspect is basically happening because you manage to dissolve the division between personal self and mind that you establish as an infant when you construct the personal self and transcend it again and understand how it works. But there is something deeper, that is that you feel that you're also sharing a state with other people, that you have an experience in which you notice that your personal.
Also, er hat ein ziemlich gutes Modell für das Bewusstsein und er kann ziemlich exakt definieren, was es ist. Kurz gesprochen, was es ist das Kontrollsystem, was deine Aufmerksamkeit steuert. Während es sozusagen das Weltmodell updatet, mit neuen Inputdaten und vergleicht mit seinen Predictions, das Error-Signal backpropagated und dabei auch die Aufmerksamkeit auf die Parts lenkt, die die besten Updates bringen.
self is moving into everything else, that you basically look out of the eyes of another person, that every agent in the world that is an observer is in some sense you.
So if
And we forget that we are the same agent.
So is it that we feel that, or do we actually accomplish it? So is telepathy possible?
Nein, mit Common Sense hat das nichts zu tun. Es geht um die Aufmerksamkeit. Du bemerkst selber, dass du aufmerksam bist. Und du bemerkst selber, dass du steuern kannst, auf was du deine Aufmerksamkeit lenkst. Das ist das Bewusstsein. Und was du mit dir selbst identifizierst, ist der Protagonist in einer Geschichte, die sich dein Gehirn erzählt. Die konsistent ist mit den Inputdaten, die du bekommst und den Entscheidungen, die du triffst. Denn das sind neue Inputdaten für den nächsten Iterationsschritt quasi an Inputdaten. Und so gehst du durch die Welt.
Is it real?
So for me, that is a question that I don't really know the answer to. In Turing's famous 1950 paper in which he describes the Turing test, he does speculate about telepathy, interestingly, and asks himself if telepathy is real, and he thinks that it very well might be. What it would be the implication for AI systems that try to be intelligent, because he didn't see a mechanism by which a computer program would become telepathic. And I suspect if telepathy would...
Doch, er meinte vor allem, man kommt da richtig gut mit Meditation hin. Es geht um den Zustand, also bei Enlightenment geht es um den Zustand, dass man selber dekonstruiert die eigene Qualia und beobachtet, wie sie implementiert ist. Im eigenen, in dieser Informationsverarbeitung, die im Kopf stattfindet. Darum geht es bei Enlightenment.
Would exist. So if all the reports that you get from people when you ask the normal person on the street, I find that very often they say, I have experiences with telepathy.
Also zu Drogen und Psychedelics hat er richtig viele Sachen schon rausgehauen. Er ist auf jeden Fall Riesenverfechter von so Psychedelics fressen und so. Finde er richtig geil.
Might not be interested in this and might not have a theory about this, but I have difficulty explaining it away. And so you could say maybe this is a superstition, or maybe it's a false memory, or maybe it's a little bit of psychosis, who knows? Maybe somebody wants to make their own life more interesting or misremember something. But a lot of people report, I noticed something terrible happened to my partner, and I noticed it exactly the moment it happened. Or my child had an accident, and I knew that was happening, and the child was in a different town. Right? So maybe it's a false memory where this is later on mistakenly attributed, but a lot of people think that is not the correct explanation. So if something like this was real, what would it mean? It probably would mean that either your body is an antenna that is sending information over all sorts of channels, like maybe just electromagnetic radio signals that you're sending over long distances, and you get attuned to another person that you spend enough time with to get a few bits out of the ether to figure out what this person is doing. Or maybe it's also when you are very close to somebody and you become empathetic with them. What happens is that you go into a resonance state with them, right? Similar to when people go into a seance and they go into a trance state and they start shifting a Ouija board around on the table. I think what happens is that their minds go via their nervous systems into a resonant state in which they basically create something like a shared dream between them.
Physical closeness or closeness broadly defined?
With physical closeness, it's much easier to experience empathy with someone, right? I suspect it would be difficult for me to have empathy for you if you were in a different town. Also, how would that work? But if you are very close to someone, you pick up all sorts of signals from their body, and not just via your eyes, but with your entire body. Mm-hmm. And if the nervous system sits on the other side and the intercellular communication sits on the other side and is integrating over all these signals, you can make inferences about the state of the other. And it's not just the personal self that does this via reasoning, but your perceptual system. And what basically happens is that your representations are directly interacting. It's the physical resonant models of the universe that exist in your nervous system and in your body.
Deswegen braucht die Oszillatoren, ne? Weil es ihm um die Resonanz geht, ne? Deswegen redet von Oszillatoren.
Go into resonance with others and start sharing some of their states. So you basically being next to somebody, you pick up some of their vibes. And feel without looking at them what they're feeling in this moment. And it's difficult for you, if you're very empathetic, to detach yourself from it and have an emotional state that is completely independent from your environment. People who are highly empathetic are describing this. And now imagine that a lot of organisms on this planet have representations of the environment and operate like this, and they are adjacent to each other and overlapping. So there's going to be some degree in which there is basically some chained interaction, and we are forming some slightly shared representation. And relatively few neuroscientists who consider this possibility. I think big a rarity in this regard is Michael Levin, who is considering these things in earnest. And I stumbled on this train of thought mostly by noticing that the tasks of a neuron can be fulfilled by other cells as well. They can send different typed chemical messages and physical messages to their
Diesen Levin-Typen, den habe ich mir noch nicht reingezogen. Als Joscha Bach das erste Mal erwähnt hat, habe ich mir angefangen, Talks von ihm anzuhören, aber ich habe es immer nicht geschafft über die 10 Minuten hinaus, weil mich immer abgelenkt habe. Aber gut, dass ich jetzt nochmal daran erinnert werde, den mir auf jeden Fall nochmal reinzuziehen. Das war interessant.
Adjacent cells and learn when to do this and when not, make this conditional and become universal function approximators. The only thing that they cannot do is telegraph information over axons very quickly over long distances, right? So neurons in this perspective are specially adapted kind of telegraph cell that has evolved so we can move our muscles very fast. But our body is in principle able to also make models of the world just much, much slower.
It's interesting, though, that at this time, at least in human history, there seems to be a gap between the tools of science.
Okay, das war mir gar nicht so klar, ne? Also, dass diese speziellen Zellen nur deswegen einfach sehr schnell in der Informationsverarbeitung sind.
Science and the subjective experience that people report, like you're talking about with telepathy, and it seems like we're not quite there.
No, I think that there is no gap between the tools of science and telepathy. Either it's there or it's not, and it's an empirical question. And if it's there, we should be able to detect it in a lab.
So why is there not a lot of Michael Levins walking around?
I don't think that Michael Levin is specifically focused on telepathy very much. He is focused on self-organization in living organisms and in brains, both as a paradigm for development and as a paradigm for information processing. And when you think about how organization processing works in organisms, there is, first of all, radical locality, which means everything is decided locally from the perspective of an individual cell. The individual cell is the agent. And the
nicht zu sagen emergent.
other one is coherence, basically. There needs to be some criterion that determines how these cells are interacting in such a way that order emerges on the next level of structure. And this principle of coherence, of imposing constraints that are not validated by the individual parts and lead to coherent structure, to basically transcendental agency, where you form an agent on the next level of organization, is crucial in this perspective.
It's so cool that radical locality leads to the emergence of complexity at the higher layers. And
I think what Mike Levin is looking at is nothing that is outside of the realm of science in any way. It's just that he is a paradigmatic thinker who develops his own paradigm. And most of the neuroscientists are using a different paradigm at this point. And this often happens in science, that a field has a few paradigms in which people try to understand reality and build concepts and make experiments.
You're kind of one of those type of paradigmatic thinkers. Actually, if we can take a tangent on that, once again, returning to the biblical verses of your tweets. You're right. My public explorations are not driven by audience service, but by my lack of ability for discovering, understanding, or following the relevant authorities. So I have to develop my own thoughts. Since I think autonomously, these thoughts cannot always be very good. That's you apologizing for the chaos of your thoughts. Or perhaps not apologizing, just identifying.
Yeah,
but let me ask the question. Since we talked about Michael Levin and yourself, who I think are very kind of radical, big, independent thinkers, can we reverse engineer your process of thinking autonomously? How do you do it? how can humans do it? How can you avoid being influenced by stage 3?
Well, why would you want to do that? It's you see what is working for you, and if it's not working for you, you build another structure that works better for you, right?
Mhm.
And so I found myself when I was thrown into this world in a state where my intuitions were not working for me. I was not able to understand how I would be able to survive in this world and build the things that I was interested in, build the kinds of relationship I needed to build, work on the topics that I wanted to make progress on. And so I had to learn. And for me, Twitter is not some tool of publication. It's not something where I put stuff that I entirely believe to be true and provable. It's an interactive notebook in which I explore possibilities. And I found that when I tried to understand how the mind and how consciousness works, I was quite optimistic. I thought there needs to be a big body of knowledge that I can just study and that works. And so I entered studies in philosophy and computer science, and later psychology and a bit of neuroscience and so on. And I was disappointed by what I found, because I found that the questions of how consciousness and so on works, how emotion works, how it's possible that the system can experience anything, how motivation emerges in the mind, were not being answered by the authorities that I met and the schools that were around. And instead, I found
Was die meisten psychischen Krankheiten verursacht. Also in allen Größenordnungen zusammengedreht, würde ich sagen, die Wettbewerbsideologie. Und ich meine damit Ideologie.
that it
Da
was
folgt im
individual
Prinzip fast
thinkers
alles
that
draus.
had useful ideas
Mhm.
that sometimes were good, sometimes were not so good, sometimes were adopted by a large group of people, sometimes were rejected by large groups of people. But for me, it was much more interesting to see these minds as individuals. And in my perspective, thinking is still something that is done not in groups, that has to be done by individuals.
So that motivated you to become an individual thinker yourself.
I didn't have a choice.
Hmm.
Basically, I didn't find a group that thought in a way where I felt, okay, I can just adopt everything that everybody thinks here, and now I understand how consciousness works, right? So, or how the mind works, or how thinking works, or what thinking even is, or what feelings are, and how they're implemented, and so on. So, to figure all this out, I had to take a lot of ideas from individuals and then try to put them together in something that works for myself. And on one hand, I think it helps if you try to go down and find first principles on which you can recreate how thinking works, how languages work, what representation is, whether representation is necessary, how the relationship between a representing agent and the world works in general.
But how do you escape the influence? Once again, the pressure of the crowd.
Ja, Friedhelm, also ich bin ja jetzt zum Beispiel auch Physiker, ich denke materialistisch sozusagen. Ne, und dann ist das natürlich wahrscheinlich alles nichts für dich. Wenn du nicht so materialistisches Universum konstruieren möchtest.
Whether it's you in responding to the pressure
Platonisch
or
übrigens auch, platonistisch.
you being swept
Und so.
up by the pressure. If you even just look at Twitter, the opinions of the crowd.
I don't feel pressure from the crowd. I'm completely immune to that. In the same sense, I don't have respect for authority. I have respect for what an individual is accomplishing, or have respect for mental firepower, or so. But it's not that I meet somebody and get slack-jawed and unable to speak, or when a large group of people has a certain idea that is different from mine, I don't necessarily feel intimidated, which has often been a problem for me in my life, because I lack instincts that other people develop at a very young age, and that help with their self-preservation in a social environment. So I had to learn a lot of things the hard way.
Yeah. So is there a practical advice you can give on how to think paradigmatically, how to think independently? Or, because you've kind of said, I had no...
Nein, Joscha Bach findet die Diskussion über den freien Willen komplett nutzlos. Deswegen geht er auch eigentlich eher nicht drauf ein, so. Aber was klar ist, dass er ein Problem mit Autoritäten hat. Und ich meine mich zu erinnern, dass am Ende dieses Gesprächs hier auch richtig gut rauskommt, dass er eigentlich ein Anarchist ist.
choice But I think to a degree you have a choice, because you said you want to be productive, and I think thinking independently is productive if what you're curious about is understanding the world, especially when the problems are very kind of new and open. And so it seems like this is a active process. Like we can choose to do that. We can practice it.
Well, there is a very basic question when you read a theory that you find convincing or interesting. How do you know? It's very interesting to figure out what are the sources of that other person, not which authority can they refer to that is then taking off the burden of being truthful, but how did this authority in turn know? What is the epistemic chain to observables? What are the first principles from which the whole thing is derived? And when I was young, I was not blessed with a lot of people around myself who knew how to make proofs from first principles. And I think mathematicians do this quite naturally. But most of the great mathematicians do not become mathematicians in school, but they tend to be self-taught. Because school teachers tend not to be mathematicians, right? They tend not to be people who derive things from first principles.
Also das Ding mit dem freien Willen ist halt, da ist das Problem mit dem frei. Also die meisten Leute wissen ja nicht mal genau, was sie damit meinen. Mit frei jetzt. Mit dem freien Willen. Das ist also ein Riesending. Und in einer Welt, das sage ich jetzt, in einer Welt, in der Kausalität angenommen wird, kannst du halt immer eine Ursache finden für einen Effekt. Und du kannst die Kaskade runterdrehen, immer weiter runterdrehen. Du kannst immer weiter die Kaskade runterdrehen. Du kannst nicht sagen, das ist die Ursache für die Entscheidung da. Das findest du nicht.
Principles. So when you ask your school teacher, why does 2 plus 2 equal 4? Does your school teacher give you the right answer? Like it's a symbol game, and there are many symbol games that we could play, and most of those games that you could just take different rules would not lead to an interesting arithmetic. And so it's just an exploration, but you can try what happens if you take different axioms. And here is how you build axioms and derive addition from them, and build addition is some basically syntactic sugar in it. And so I wish that somebody would have opened me this vista and explained to me how I can build a language in my own mind, and from which I can derive what I'm seeing, and which I can make geometry and counting and all the number games that we are playing in our life. And on the other hand, I felt that I learned a lot of this while I was programming as a child. When you start out with a computer like a Commodore 64, which doesn't have a lot of functionality, it's relatively easy to see how.
Bela Funk, ich habe dazu ja Video gemacht schon, dem Dogma des freien Willens und wie man sozusagen gerade im Kontext des Justizsystems damit umgehen könnte. Und was es besser machen würde, wenn man nicht ständig diese Ideologie des libertären freien Willens annehmen würde, die übrigens auch in der christlichen Kirche und den anderen monotheistischen Religionen übelst wichtig ist. Weiß ich nicht, also es ist keine Glaubensfrage. Es gibt keinen wissenschaftlichen Hinweis darauf, dass irgendwie der freie Wille irgendwas ist, was wir beobachten können. Gibt es nicht. Es gibt nichts, was darauf hindeutet. Null. Gar nichts. Es ist einfach nur eine Illusion, der wir gerne alle anhängen. Aber ja, ich gebe dir recht, es ist ein hilfreiches Konstrukt. Es ist ein hinreichendes und hilfreiches soziales Konstrukt. Oftmals. Trotzdem sollte man im Hinterkopf haben, das ist also jetzt mal wirklich der freie Wille. Also, nein. Das ergibt keinen Sinn. Man kann einfach kein kohärentes Weltmodell aufbauen, in dem der freie Wille existiert.
Bunch of relatively simple circuits are just basically performing hashes between bit patterns, and how you can build the entirety of mathematics and computation on top of this.
Friedhelm, ich denke, das ist ein Trugschluss. Das ist wirklich ein Trugschluss. Das ist einfach so ein festes Festklammern an dieser Illusion. So von wegen, ja, wenn es keinen freien Willen gäbe, dann könnte ich ja jetzt sofort meine Mutter umbringen oder so. So ein Schwachsinn. Oder dann hat doch nichts mehr Bedeutung oder so. Das sind alles so, da fällt einem sofort dieser religiöse Charakter auf, der an dieser Illusion dran klebt.
maths and all the representational languages that you need.
Man, Commodore 64 could be one of the sexiest machines ever built, if I say so myself. If we can return to this really interesting idea that we started to talk about with panpsychism.
Sure.
And the complex resonator paradigm and the verses of your tweets.
Naja, nur Gehirnchemie. Also kommt ein bisschen drauf an jetzt. Aber ja, man könnte schon so sagen. Weil DNA und Vererbung und das ist ja auch alles Chemie. Ne? Chemie ist aber die Physik der äußeren Atomhülle auch. Also, und der Informationstransport. Also ja, irgendwie, klar, Gehirnchemie, meinetwegen, nenn's so.
You're right. Instead of treating eyes, ears, and skin as separate sensory systems with fundamentally different modalities, we might understand them as overlapping aspects of the same universe, coupled at the same temporal resolution, and almost inseparable from a single shared resonant model. Instead of treating mental representations as fully isolated between minds, the representations of physically adjacent observers might directly interact and produce causal effects through the coordination of the perception and behavior of world modeling observers. So the modalities, the distinction between modalities, let's throw that away. The distinction between the individuals, let's throw that away. So what does this interaction representations look like?
And you think about how you represent the interaction of us in this room.
Yeah.
At some level, you can the modalities are quite distinct. They're not completely distinct, but you can see this as vision. You can close your eyes, and then you don't see a lot anymore. But you still imagine how my mouth is moving when you hear something, and you know that.
Friedhelm, mir geht's doch nur darum, wenn du eine Entscheidung getroffen hast und im Nachhinein dir denkst, ich hätte mich auch anders entscheiden können. Es gibt kein wiederholbares Experiment. Es ist unwissenschaftlich anzunehmen, dass es so ist, weil wir es nicht beobachten können. Es ist unmöglich, es herauszufinden. Hingegen sprechen alle wissenschaftlichen Fakten dagegen. Es ist einfach nur Teil der Geschichte, die wir uns erzählen, in der wir der Protagonist sind, mit einem Entscheidungsspielraum, den wir abschätzen, als Teil unseres Weltmodells. Die Entscheidung wird aber getroffen. Und manchmal wird die Entscheidung, also es gibt so viele mögliche, nicht monokausale Zusammenhänge, die zu solchen Dingen wie einer Entscheidung führen. Nicht nur, was du zum Frühstück gegessen hast, sondern zum Beispiel, was deine Urgroßeltern für einen Job hatten, kann darauf einen Einfluss haben. Epigenetik, der ganze Scheiß. Irgendwelche zivilisatorischen Traumata. Irgendwas. Sachen aus der Urzeit, Sachen von vor 1000 Jahren. Du kannst den Unterschied zum Beispiel zwischen Reisfarmern und Weizenfarmern in China messen. Kulturell. In bestimmten Entscheidungsparadigmen. Ob sie eher selfish sind oder ob sie eher kollektivistisch sind. Weil es nämlich einen kleinen Bereich oben im Norden gibt in China, wo sie nicht Reis angebaut haben. Und da gibt es einen kulturellen Unterschied, der sich dann aber auf mikroskopische Entscheidungen runterbricht und den man statistisch signifikant nachmessen kann. Und niemand würde sagen, das liegt daran, dass meine Großeltern da oben Weizen angebaut haben. Aber so ist es. Freier Wille, wirklich. Nein. Niemals. Es gibt so viele Genkombinationen, die irgendwelche Einflüsse haben, die noch gar nicht vollständig entschlüsselt sind. Nur so auf so einem Level von, keine Ahnung, Proteinen und irgendwelchen Botenstoffen und so. Es ist übelst heftig, aber es ist definitiv nicht so, dass sich da irgendwo ein freier Wille oder wie auch immer, also wie gesagt, es ist übelst schwammig. Freier Wille könnt ihr gar nicht, keiner von euch kann mir hier genau sagen, was er damit meint, wette ich mit euch.
That it's very close to the sound that you can just open your eyes and you get back into this shared merged space. And we also have these experiments where we notice that the way in which my lips are moving are affecting how you hear the sound. And also vice versa. The sounds that you're hearing have an influence on how you interpret some of the visual features. And so these modalities are not separate in your mind. They are merged at some fundamental level where you are interpreting the entire scene that you're in. And your own interactions in the scene are also not completely separate from the interactions of the other individual in the scene, but there is some resonance that is going on where we also have a degree of shared mental representations and shared empathy due to being in the same space and having vibes between each other.
Vibes. So the question, though, is how deeply intertwined is this multimodality, multi-agent system? Like how, I mean, this is going to the telepathy question without the woo.
Also, Gott ist ja jetzt erstmal ein völlig schwurbeliger Begriff. Urknall hingegen ist schon ungefähr klar, was damit gemeint ist. So ungefähr. Keine Ahnung. Ich weiß nicht, was du von mir hören willst.
Woo meaning of the word telepathy is like how, like what's going on here in this room right now?
So if telepathy would work, how could it work?
Yeah.
Right. So imagine that all the cells in your body are sending signals in a similar way as neurons are doing. Right? Just by touching the other cells and sending chemicals to them, the other cells interpreting them, learning how to react to them, and they learn how to approximate functions in this way and compute behavior for the organisms.
Ja, Intelligent Design ist Bullshit. Das ist meine Meinung. Klar. Das brauchen wir nicht. Wir brauchen nur Emergenz. Wir müssen verstehen, wie Filterprozesse und Evolutionsdruck emergiert. Dann brauchen wir kein Intelligent Design. Das ist ein naturalistischer Fehlschluss.
And this is something that is open to plants as well. Right? So plants probably have software running on them that is controlling how the plant is working in a similar way as you have a mind that is controlling how you are behaving in the world. And this spirit of plants is something that has been very well described by our ancestors, and they found this quite normal. But for some reason, since the Enlightenment, we are treating this notion that there are spirits in nature and that plants have spirits as a superstition. And I think we probably have to rediscover that plants have software running on them. And we already did, right? We noticed that there is a control system in the plant that connects every part of the plant to every other part of the plant and produces coherent behavior in the plant. That is, of course, much, much slower than the coherent behavior in an animal like us that has a nervous system where everything is synchronized much, much faster by the neurons. But what you also notice is that if a plant is sitting next to another plant, like you have a very old tree and this tree is building some kind of information highway along its cells so it can send information from its leaves to its roots and from some part of the root to another part of the roots, and there is a fungus living next to the tree, the fungus can probably piggyback on the communication between the cells of the tree and send its own signals to the tree. And vice versa, the tree might be able to send information to the fungus. Because after all, how would they build a viable firewall if that other organism is sitting next to them all the time and it's never moving away? Right? So they will have to get along. And over a long enough time frame, the networks of roots in the forest and all the other plants that are there and the fungi that are there might be forming something like a biological internet.
But the question there is, do they have to be touching? Is biology at a distance possible?
Of course, you can use any kind of physical signal. You can use sounds, you can use electromagnetic waves that are integrated over many cells. So it's conceivable that across distances, there are many kinds of information pathways. But also, our planetary surface is pretty full of organisms, full of cells.
So everything is touching everything else.
Yeah.
Friedhelm, das Problem an emergenten Systemen, also komplexen Systemen, vernetzten Systemen, ist, dass Ursache und Wirkung da permanent die Rollen tauschen, weil man halt Wechselkreisläufe hat. Ändert aber nichts daran, dass da nirgendwo ein freier Wille entstehen kann. Emergenz ist ein wichtiger Begriff. Das Problem ist, den gibt es quasi im deutschen Sprachgebrauch noch nicht. Ich würde sagen, es ist der wichtigste Begriff der Moderne, um überhaupt irgendwas zu verstehen, was bei uns abgeht. Und dazu habe ich übrigens schon ein Video gemacht.
And it's been doing this for many millions and even billions of years. So there was enough time for information processing networks to form. And if you think about how a mind is self-organizing, basically it needs to...
Herr Doktor, impf mir nix. Da musst du mir erstmal klar machen, was du mit Zufall meinst. Grob gesprochen würde ich sagen, alles, was wir beobachten können, ist Resultat aus Zufall. Das könnte man grob gesprochen so sagen. Aber das hängt ein bisschen davon ab, was du jetzt genau damit meinst. Ich habe eigentlich keinen Bock, diese Diskussion zu führen. Evolution ist ja sowas wie eine Monte-Carlo-Simulation. Da braucht man auf jeden Fall Zufall dafür. Sowas wie zum Beispiel Brownsche Teilchenbewegung ist ja auch Tunneleffekt. Das sind alles ja Sachen, die quasi, da sagen wir dazu, das ist Zufall.
In some sense, reward the cells for computing the mind, for building the necessary dynamics between the cells that allow the mind to stabilize itself and remain on there. But if you look at the spirits of plants that are growing very close to each other in the forest, that might be almost growing into each other, these spirits might be able even to move to some degree, not to become somewhat dislocated and shift around in that ecosystem, right? And so if you think about what a mind is, it's a bunch of activation waves that form coherent patterns and process information in a way that are colonizing an environment well enough to allow the continuous sustenance of the mind, the continuous stability and self-stabilization of the mind, then it's conceivable that we can link into this biological internet, not necessarily at the speed of our nervous system, but maybe at the speed of our body, and make some kind of subconscious connection to the world where we use our body as an antenna into biological information processing. Now, these ideas are completely speculative. I don't know if any of that is true. But if that was true, and if you want to explain telepathy, I think it's much more likely that that telepathy could be explained using such mechanisms rather than undiscovered quantum processes that would break the standard model of physics.
Bin ich auch dafür, ne? Also wenn dann, ja, why not, ne?
Could there be undiscovered processes that don't break?
Yeah, so if you think about something like an internet in the forest, that is something that is borderline discovered. There are basically a lot of scientists who point out that they do observe that plants are communicating in the forest through root networks and send information, for instance, warn each other about new pests entering the forest and things are happening like this. So basically, there is communication between plants and fungi that has been observed.
Well, it's been observed, but we haven't plugged into it. So it's like if you observe humans, they seem to be communicating with a smartphone thing, but you don't understand how a smartphone works and how the mechanism of the internet works. But we're like, maybe it's possible to really understand the full richness of the biological internet that connects us.
An interesting question is whether the communication and the organization principles of biological information processing are as complicated as the technology that we've built. They set up on very different principles, right? They simultaneously works very differently in biological systems, and the entire thing needs to be stochastic, and instead of being fully deterministic or almost fully deterministic as our digital computers are. So there is a different base protocol layer that would emerge over the biological structure if such a thing would be happening. And again, I'm not saying here that telepathy works and not saying that this is not woo, but what I'm saying is I think I'm open to a possibility that we see that a few bits can be traveling long distance between organisms using biological information processing in ways that we are not completely aware of right now, and that are more similar to many of the stories that were completely normal for our ancestors.
Well, this kind of interlined representations takes us to the big ending of your tweet series. You write, quote, "I wonder if self-improving AGI might end up saturating physical environments with intelligence to such a degree that isolation of individual mental states becomes almost impossible, and the representations of all complex self-organizing agents merge permanently with each other." So that's a really interesting idea. This biological network, life network, gets so dense.
Also hier kann ich euch allen nur empfehlen, Daniel Schmachtenberger. Na, der hat ja diesen Take, dass Kapitalismus nichts anderes ist als eine nicht misalignte quasi AGI. Und wir sind quasi das Substrat, auf der die emergiert.
That it might as well be seen as one. That's an interesting. What do you think that looks like? What do you think that saturation looks like? What does it feel like?
I think it's a possibility. It's just a vague possibility. And I like to explain. But what this looks like, I think that the end game of AGI is substrate agnostic. That means that AGI ultimately, if it is being built, is going to be smart enough to understand how AGI works.
Mm-hmm.
This means it's not going to be better than people at AGI research and can take over in building the next generation, but it fully understands how it works and how it's being implemented. And also, of course, understands how computation works in nature, how to build new feedback loops that you can turn into your own circuits. And this means that the AGI is likely to virtualize itself into any environment that can compute. So it's not breaking free from the silicon substrate and is going to move into the ecosystems, into our bodies, our brains, and is going to merge with all the agency that it finds there.
Yeah.
Daniel Schmachtenberger. Daniel Schmachtenberger.
So it's conceivable that you end up with completely integrated information processing across all computing systems, including biological computation on Earth. That we end up triggering some new step in the evolution where basically some Gaia is being built over the entirety of all digital and biological computation. And if this happens, then basically everywhere around us, you will have agents that are connected and that are representing and building models of the world, and their representations will physically interact. They will vibe with each other. And if you find yourself into an environment that is saturated with modeling compute, where basically you almost every grain of sand could be part of computation that is at some point being started by the AI, you could find yourself in a situation where you cannot escape this shared representation anymore, and where you indeed notice that everything in the world has one shared resonant model of everything that's happening on the planet, and you notice which part you are in this thing, and you become part of a very larger, almost holographic mind in which all the parts are observing each other and form a coherent whole.
So you lose the ability to notice yourself as a distinct entity.
No, I think that when you're conscious in your own mind, you notice yourself as a distinct entity. You notice yourself as a self-reflexive observer. And I suspect that we become conscious at the beginning of our mental development, not at some very high level. Consciousness seems to be part of a training mechanism that biological nervous systems have to discover to become trainable, because you cannot take a nervous system like ours and do stochastic gradient descent with backpropagation over 100 layers. Right? This would not be stable on biological neurons. And so instead, we start with some colonizing principle, in which...
Das ist schön, ne? Also er sagt quasi, die Vanishing Gradients sind das Problem. Ne? Man braucht das. Consciousness ist eine Notwendigkeit, damit diese komplexen Control Agents überhaupt ihre Aufgabe erfüllen können. Und wahrscheinlich bei kleineren Organismen braucht man das nicht. Ne? Also sowas wie ein Einzeller oder so. Der braucht kein Consciousness und kein Weltmodell. Weil er gar nicht sozusagen das Interface hat, um überhaupt, er kriegt nicht genug Daten dafür rein und er hat auch nicht genug Entscheidungsraum. Consciousness ist sozusagen ein Resultat daraus, dass die Daten, die wir bekommen, schon ausreichend sind sozusagen und zu viel. Und sie müssen irgendwie komprimiert werden. Schon allein diese Entscheidung, quasi die Entscheidung, ist ja keine Entscheidung, sondern das ist Evolutionsdruck, ne? Wie sich das entwickelt und wie dann sozusagen welche Informationen wie verarbeitet werden und so. Man braucht Consciousness dafür, dass wir die Sache mit der Aufmerksamkeit haben, um besser zu trainieren, wie wir unser Surprisal minimieren können, also bessere Vorhersagen treffen können, ne? Nur um unser Weltmodell besser zu machen. Und es ist auch klar, dass Consciousness AFK geht, sobald wir die Welt entschlüsselt hätten, ne? Was wir natürlich nicht erreichen können. Aber wenn wir es hätten, ne, dann gehen wir AFK. Dann brauchen wir kein Bewusstsein mehr. Dann wissen wir ja schon alles quasi.
A part of the mental representations form a notion of being a self-reflexive observer that is imposing coherence on its environment. And this spreads until the boundary of your mind. And if that boundary is no longer clear-cut, because AI is jumping across substrates, it would be interesting to see what a global mind would look like. That is basically producing a globally coherent language of thought. and is representing everything from all the possible vantage points.
That's an interesting world.
The intuition that this thing grew out of is a particular mental state, and it's a state that you find sometimes in literature. For instance, Neil Gaiman describes it in The Ocean at the End of the Lane. And it's this idea that, or this experience, that there is a state in which you feel that you know everything that can be known, and that in your normal human mind, you've only forgotten. You've forgotten that you are the entire universe. And some people describe this after they've taken extremely large amount of mushrooms or had a big spiritual experience as a hippie in their 20s, and they notice basically that they are in everything, and their body is only one part of the universe and nothing ends at their body, and actually everything is observing, and they're part of this big observer, and the big observer is focused as one local point in their body and their personality and so on. But we can basically have this oceanic state in which we have no boundaries and are one with everything. And a lot of meditators call this the non-dual state, because you no longer have the separation between self and world. And as I said, you can explain the state relatively simply without panpsychism or anything else, but just by breaking down the constructed boundary between self and world in our own mind. But if you combine this with the notion that systems are physically interacting to the point where their representations are merging and interacting with each other, you would literally implement something like this. Right? It would still be a representational state. You would not be one with physics itself. It would still be coarse-grained. It would still be much slower than physics itself. But it would be a representation in which you become aware that you're part of some kind of global information processing system, like a thought in the global mind, and a conscious thought that coexisting with many other self-reflexive thoughts.
I would love to observe that from a video game design perspective, how that game looks.
Maybe you will after we build AGI and it takes over.
But would you be able to step out of the whole thing, just kind of watch? The way we can now. Sometimes when I'm at a crowded party or something like this, you step back and you realize all the different costumes, all the different interactions, all the different computation, that all the individual people are at once distinct from each other and at once all the same.
But it's already what we do, right? We can have thoughts that are integrative, and we can have thoughts that are highly dissociated from everything else and experience themselves as separate.
Yeah. But you want to allow yourself to have those thoughts. Sometimes you kind of resist it.
I think that it's not normative. It's more descriptive. I want to understand the space of states that we can be in and that people are reporting and make sense of them. It's not that I believe that it's your job in life to get to a particular kind of state and then you get a high score.
Or maybe you do. I think you're really against this high scoring thing. I kind of like it.
Yeah, you're probably very competitive and I'm not.
No, not competitive.
Noch so ein Indiz dafür, dass Joscha Bach eigentlich ein Anarchist ist.
Like role-playing games, like Skyrim, it's not competitive. There's a nice thing, there's a nice feeling where your experience points go up. You're not competing against anybody, but it's the world saying, you're on the right track. Here's a point.
That's the game saying it. It's the game economy. And I found when I was playing games and was getting addicted to these systems, then I would get into the game and hack it. So I get control over the scoring system and would no longer be subject to it.
So you're no longer playing, you're trying to hack it.
I don't want to be addicted to anything. I want to be in charge. I want to have agency over what I do.
Addiction is the loss of control for you?
Yes. Addiction means that you're doing something compulsively. And the opposite of free will is not determinism, it's compulsion.
You don't want to lose yourself in the addiction to something nice? Addiction to love, to the pleasant feelings we humans experience?
No, I find this gets old. Right? I don't want to have the best possible emotions. I want to have the most appropriate emotions. I don't want to have the best possible experience. I want to have an adequate experience that is serving my goals, the stuff that I find meaningful in this world.
From the biggest questions of consciousness, let's explore the pragmatic, the projections of those big ideas into our current world.
Okay, hier hören wir auf für heute. Es ist jetzt um 1. Das ist eine gute Zeit. Ich habe morgen tatsächlich 2, 3 Tasks und so. Ich muss was machen. Das heißt, ich muss auch irgendwann früh aufstehen und so ein Scheiß. Es war mal wieder herrlich. Joscha Bach ist eh immer geil und so. Herr Dr. Impfminix hat jetzt wirklich Jordan Peterson rausgesucht, ne? Das ist schade. Das ist auf vielen Ebenen schade. Aber gut. Ich rede jetzt irgendwen. Ja, Jordan Peterson ist vor allem ein christlicher Esoteriker. Ne? Und Protofaschist im Wesentlichen. Das weiß er zwar selber nicht, aber ja. Wir reden. MDB Smash. Ihr wisst Bescheid. So. Gute Nacht, Leute. Ciao.